So, good afternoon. My name is Simon Howard. I'm from the Developer Relations team in EMEA, and today's talk is all about porting an iOS application to BlackBerry 10. I have with me my colleague Slavek. He's going to introduce himself. In this session, we are both talking, so we'll hop between one another. If you have questions, we'll take them. There's also a bit of a Q&A session at the end if we have time as well. Okay, Slavek.
All right, so I'm Slavek. I'm also from Developer Relations out of Canada, and on a daily basis, I work with vendors and partners on bringing BlackBerry 10 applications, possibly sometimes from other platforms, sometimes writing them from scratch. We've been doing a lot of projects where there are some applications that were first originally written on iOS, and so we're here to just share our experiences of what the process is. We called it porting, but right up front we want to say it's not really porting. There's no magic button. There's no, because porting really means to us that you recompile your code, you change a number of variables, and you got your application. But these are really two different platforms, and the reason why you go into with a different platform is that you want to leverage the capabilities of those platforms, also the uniqueness of each platform. So we believe our platform offers something unique, and our framework Cascades offers something unique to the users. So it's not a simple process of porting an application. We want to equip you with basic tools and strategy for how to bring your iOS application onto our platform. So we're going to discuss the basics of our framework and how it compares to the iOS framework, as well as some of the UI components and the user experience, and where we differ, where iOS differs. And we're going to talk about the services of each platform and how to best bring an iOS application onto our platform, but also highlight some of the differences of our platform, so that when you do bring your application, that you're not just thinking about your iOS application, try to bring that onto our platform, but also leverage the uniqueness of the platform and get that experience that BlackBerry users will expect out of BlackBerry 10. So a brief introduction to the architecture. And so there's some similarity in the platform, as you can see from the ground up, obviously, all going from the bottom and looking at the kernels and drivers. It's kind of a Unix-like world and on both platforms. So you've got a lot of the low-level APIs are very familiar. In fact, if you're thinking about how to write a project from scratch, if you have that opportunity, later on we can discuss how you can actually have projects in C++ on iOS and leverage open source components, actually, because there's a lot of core similarities at the bottom layers. Obviously, the operating systems are completely different. It's just the APIs. The core services on iOS, and we have our core services at the bottom layer with the BPS. Most of the time when you're writing Cascades applications, you need to go to this layer. However, there are certain cases where you do need to go to this layer for, let's say, certain Bluetooth APIs or certain keyboard APIs, and so some of those have not been exposed in Cascades yet. The graphics and audio APIs, then we build on top with the application framework APIs, so like the maps, message. We're going to go over the details of these and how they kind of compare a little bit later on. And the key thing also to mention here is that you've got the WebKit engine on both platforms. So that, that kind of contrasts with, let's say, Windows mobile, where you don't have the WebKit, and as you know, there are certain, if you're bringing HTML assets in your applications, you can rely on certain WebKit specific functionality, even though you're supposed to be bringing them HTML5, so all applications should be HTML5 compliant now, and we certainly have that built in our WebKit engine as well. And then on iOS, you've got the UI kit, and then that's how we're going to contrast and compare that to our Cascades framework and QML.
Okay, so let's talk about the process then. So as Sławek said, there is no, press a button type way of porting your application, your iOS application to BlackBerry 10. You could contrast with Android, for example, if you have an Android application. We do provide the Android runtime SDK, and you can, if you're lucky, and for a good percentage you can actually just repackage that Android APK and put it on a BlackBerry 10 device if you're not using APIs that are not compatible. But we don't have that when you're porting an iOS application. So what do you do? Well, there's kind of like the obvious things. The first thing you need to do, if you're not used to BlackBerry 10, it's obvious, right? But you need to ramp up. You need to go to developer.blackberry.com/native, install the SDK simulator, download the samples. I will say this now, I've always thought the samples that we've produced, which are, by the way, produced by the TAC guys you've seen this week, including the guy that got on the stage, Johan. They're awesome samples, and they're probably the best way, I think, right now, of actually learning how to port to BlackBerry 10. You've got samples that are very basic and quite funky hello world sample, and you've got more complicated samples there. So that's the thing to do. Look at those samples, work through the tutorials there as well, read the UI guidelines, because that's quite cool as well. That will tell you and make you think about the controls that you've got available to you on BlackBerry 10, and think about how I can actually create my BlackBerry 10 application from my iOS reference. Of course, you need to get sign-in keys as well. That should be one of the first things you need to do, because before you can put your app on a device, you need to have a debug token, and you need sign-in keys to go and do that. Okay, so once you've, I'm trying to go forward here. Yeah, it worked. Once you've done that step and you've ramped up, then you need to start thinking about your application. So at this stage, you now know the basics about BlackBerry 10. Now you can now start thinking about getting that iOS app onto BlackBerry 10. So what do you need to do? So look at your UI and your user experience. Now we're going to talk about this in more detail a little bit later in the presentation. You need to think about, have you got any reusable code that you could actually take and put it on BlackBerry 10? And there are lots of options there, and it really depends on how you developed your iOS app. We'll talk about Objective-C, how you port that in a little while. But you might have, for example, some C code that will quite easily port to BlackBerry 10. So you've got that consideration. Obviously, you've got Objective-C code probably typically in your iOS application. That'll be very heavily hooked in, probably a lot of it, into your UI. You're going to have to rewrite that. That's the fact. We'll talk about that in a minute. There may be some other sort of non-reusable, non-UI related code that you can't port. You're going to have to rewrite that too as well. So this process is all about identifying the structure of your code, the architecture, the UI that you have, and how it'll map on. And then, of course, you need to actually build it, test it, and so on, and then ultimately submit it. So what about the tools? So, personally, I like Xcode. I've developed the code on iOS. I like that environment they have. It's nice. You can design UI quite easily, dragging and dropping controls and so on if you want to. It's a nice environment. Now, I think what we have, by contrast, on BlackBerry 10 is also very cool. It's going to get better, but it's really, really cool, I think. Most of the developers that I work with like using QML rather than, let's say, using C++ to render the UI. And I think from that point of view, if you're creating an app that way, you can create your views in your UI really quickly. So there's a lot of similarity. We'll talk more about it in a minute, but I think it's a cool development environment. Okay, so let's get down to the nitty-gritty. So I basically created a little app. I'm going to show it to you now, just walk you through some of the principles in case you're not familiar with the tool chain. So the app that I created basically was based on a sample app, basically in a book, and it was a bit of iOS code. And I thought, well, what I wanted to do is port that to BlackBerry 10, and I went through the process of doing that. And I followed those sort of stages that we've already kind of talked about. So what we have And the first thing I'll do is actually run the app so you get a feeling what we're talking about. So I'll go do that. I'm going to run it on the simulator for ease. It's deploying now, I think, hopefully. Nearly there. So it's deployed it to the device. It's actually quite a simple app. All it does is basically go to a website, it's done that now, and basically retrieve a picture of a flower based on a setting I define, which is the type of the color of the flower I want, and a random value which determines a random flower that it's going to fetch. When I created this application initially, the kind of reference app that was basically in a book was quite basic. It was just showing some key things about developing an iOS application. And I thought about, I went through the process of redesigning that application so it used some of the design idioms that we have on BlackBerry 10. So for example, at the bottom, you have an action bar here with 3 tabs. You can see I haven't got unique icons. I could obviously further modify this app so I had nicer icons. I haven't done that. And it's also got a menu here as well where I can go and say, give me a new flower. There's an activity indicator there. So this application, and let's just talk about how I did it. So basically what you see here is a web view. That's really easy to do in Cascades. It's awesomely easy, and I'll show you the code very quickly in a second. None of the code that you see here, by the way, is C++, other than the settings part of it, and I'll tell you why that's in a second. But it was really easy to do. Now, I think the strength of what we have, and for you, if you port in from iOS, is basically QML. It's ever so easy to use. So very quickly, going through the structure of this app, what I have, you can see here, 4 QML documents. The general recommended practice when you're creating an app is you have 1 QML document per view. That's a good, efficient way of doing it. In fact, you can make it more efficient, but we're not covering that today. And in terms of the main view you saw there, which is the picture of the flower, that's implemented by this particular QML document called flowerscreen.qml. And all I have in there, basically, is obviously some containers to group my controls together. And ultimately, I have 2 things I'll point out to you. I have basically a web view, which, in fact, I have 2 web views, but I have one main one here, which is this guy. And I've got a second one down here, which is basically, you haven't seen that, but it basically just displays information about the flower. Now, all this stuff here is quite funky. It was quite easy for me to do this. One of the things, for example, I wanted to do was I wanted to allow for the case where there might be a slow web connection, and I didn't want to have to see the end user, let's see, seeing the flower gradually being filled in because the connection might be slow. So what I do is I basically trap a signal which is generated when the loading is finished. I trap that here, and I've got some JavaScript code which basically traps that and basically makes the view of the flower, the picture, the web view, enabled. It makes it visible when that download is finished. So very quickly, you can see the kind of things that you can do in QML. There is hardly any C++ here at all. And the only C++ in this particular app is just used to basically serialize and load back settings which I store in the file system. And to be quite honest with you, the quickest way for me to do that is using C++ and some cute classes. Okay, so that's an overview of an app that I created from an iOS reference. Okay, here you go.
Thanks. So let me now go into switch the screens. Let me now go into the some of the steps and some of the analysis that we would do when porting an application, and kind of look at the UX and UI guidelines and discuss those. So you saw at the keynote, we really emphasized that we wanted, beautiful applications, and we built Cascades to create beautiful applications. and leverage, the design principles and use gestures instead of clicks. And we've created, UI guidelines for that. And judging by the questions I got from a lot of the iOS developers I worked with, even a lot of the iOS applications don't follow the iOS guidelines, because when you read the guidelines, there are a lot of similarities in the guidelines in the fact that you should avoid clicks, you should use gestures instead of clicks. Of course, the gestures differ on BlackBerry 10 and then on iOS, but one of the key messages here is, as you're looking at bringing a iOS application to BlackBerry 10, this is really your first step, because there you will see majority of the differences in your user interface and how it's going to differ from your iOS application. And one of the key messages, I would say, is do not try to force an iOS look on BlackBerry 10, because one, first, it's probably going to be hard because those components don't exist. And second, it's probably not going to be that user-friendly, and it's not going to be something that users expect. For example, I even was asked by developers on how do you replicate the same button look that you have, right? So, obviously, there's a reason for that iOS set the precedent of how touchscreen controls should look, but since then platforms have evolved, so I think it's important to really adopt to the new platform. And so it's really, we've updated the UI guidelines with 10.1, so it's really the first step to look at. So now let's look at some of the application states that you need to consider on the different platforms and how the platforms differ, because when you're writing your application, you need to keep in mind that applications can go through different states, and so there are some differences on the platforms. So on iOS, you have your application inactive or active, but there's also the notion of a background application and a background suspended application. Now, to contrast that with BlackBerry 10, you can have a normal state, a thumbnail state, but also a hidden inactive state. So probably the biggest difference here is that in iOS, you have certain services that allow applications to run in headless mode. So they're not visible, like VoIP services or certain navigation services, which is currently something that's not supported on BlackBerry 10. So we will discuss ways of working around that for now until the next release, and we've heard at the keynote that we're actually bringing those onto BlackBerry 10. Now, one of the key things when you're thinking about application states to leverage the uniqueness of the platforms is to actually use application covers. They're very easy to add, and I've seen not too many apps are leveraging them, but they're really a cool way of making your app visible as it's in a minimized state and it's currently not running. You can have different card views, and you can see the code for actually updating the cards is really quite simple. So you create a unique experience on the platform through that. I think it's really something you should leverage, and something that's not available on iOS. Let's look at navigation, where you actually see a lot of similarities. And so you've seen Simon show Xcode and a lot of applications that you build, and you start, when you start from scratch, you'll use the navigation controller, which is very easy. You could just drop it in Xcode, and you can start building your UI that way. Now, on BlackBerry 10, we have a navigation pane. So it's a very similar concept, and you'll find a lot of similarity there. So like Simon said, well, we have to rewrite the UI. But at the same time, a lot of these components actually match, so you can see which component you need to replace with which. And so we also have a porting guide available on our website. So if you're interested in how to map these UI components in a further detail, you should reference the porting guide as well. So what about views, Simon?
Let's talk about views. My mic on. Okay, cool. For your application, you're going to have a set of views in that application. And my recommendation to you is what you need to do is look at each of those views individually. Now, as Sławek said, what you shouldn't do is basically do a direct mapping of your iOS app in terms of design to BlackBerry 10, because you'll end up with a BlackBerry 10 application which kind of looks iOS-like. That said, there is a lot of mapping between the controls in iOS and in BlackBerry 10. But what you need is that user experience that makes the app feels like it's a BlackBerry 10 application, and the user will like that fact. But you also, let's face it, want to make the job a little bit easier for yourself as well. So what you need to do is basically what's shown in that process, which is basically assess the controls, think about what would you need to do to make that particular view part of a great BlackBerry 10 application. Think about the controls, look at the mapping between the controls in iOS and BlackBerry 10. We'll look at that in a second. And then create custom controls if you need to. If you want a particular view that's really essential to the design of a particular view in your application, you can do that. It's really easy in QML to create a custom control either from content that you draw completely yourself or by amalgamating core controls in Cascades. Okay? So let me now go over some of the common views and how you will map them, and just highlight some of the differences. So let's start with the navigation bar and the action bar. So you can see right away there's a lot of similarity here, but I want to point the differences here. First of all, with the UI guidelines, the screenshots that I got from iOS, they're not full screen. They probably should be, because the UI guidelines for iOS also say you should put content at the front. But we go even a step further. We provide you with the action bar, and that actually hides itself if you. It has the capability of hiding itself if you're not clicking on the screen. We really want to put the content at the center, because that's what the users really care about. One of the other things to point out about the navigation, the action bar, you see we stress the one-handed use of the device. So we try to put as many of the controls that you use frequently at the bottom of the screen, not at the top. So that's the navigation bar. It maps from iOS to BlackBerry 10. Now with the tab bar, it's a very actually similar component. Look how similar. I mean, at the bottom you see there's almost a direct mapping here of the way it looks. However, when we look at the tab overflows, there's some difference here. We want the application to really flow. So when you go to a tab overflow on BlackBerry 10, you're not really changing your context. You're not going to a different screen. On iOS, you will actually go to a different screen and overflow. So we try to really reduce the number of clicks, and most of the time with the overflow, you can just basically swipe back to the main screen. Now the context menu is slightly different on iOS. Essentially, you would, what you're used to as an iOS developer, you will override, depending on what context, you override the action in the navigation bar. So you will change a certain action. On BlackBerry 10, we provide you with a context menu, so that basically when you long press for a second or so, you will get a different context for that component. So I think it's something to keep in mind. And so some of the arguments I heard about, against the context menu, and so
the main argument against it, well, is something that's not visible. How can a user discover it? And certainly, that's something you must consider. It's a valid use case, so it's got to be something that makes sense for a component. So users have to somehow discover it, but do not shy away from using the context menu because you feel that users may not know that there's a certain actionable item there. It's really a built-in system built-in action, so you should leverage it. However, bear in mind that there could be a discoverability problem with that. So, but we have the action bar for certain main items and the tab bar as well. So now in terms of overflow, the action bar overflow is where you put a lot of the actions that don't really fit on the screen. On iOS, you have the similar concept of a curl. Let's say in the map application, you need to perform a certain action. You will curl a page, and you'll click a button, and you'll go back to the page. We've solved it with the overflow action bar button. So, a lot of the users, the core BlackBerry 10 users, will be used to using action bar overflows and tab overflows, and in certain cases where it makes sense, the context menu. In terms of sheets and dialogues, you'll get a very similar kind of mapping between the two platforms. On our platform, you can also have dialogues that are not full screen, and sheets actually will always be full screen. And on sheets, you will put modal views, so basically views that take you out of context of your application flow and maybe perform a single action. So let's say an action to send an email or look up a calendar contact or something like that, and then you will go back into your application. So let's further look into the settings. Where do you put the settings on the two platforms? And this is something that every application needs to do. So really on iOS, you will put it in the settings, and then if you want to access the settings from your application, you will provide a shortcut to it. Now, on BlackBerry 10, you have the swipe down menu from the top. And this is something that I've seen sometimes people misuse. So the settings menu is really meant, so the top menu is really meant for settings and infrequently used actions. So some apps I've seen, they put more items there. They put items that are frequently used that shouldn't be used. Really, this is only for settings, and this is probably the best place to put settings. And the argument, again, sometimes people pointed out to me, well, the browser doesn't do that. Well, the browser should do that, and but a lot of our other applications do that, and hopefully the browser will do that soon as well. But
Okay, so let's go back to thinking about controls. So now at this stage, you've thought about the tabs you're using in your iOS application, how they map onto BlackBerry 10, action bars, and so on. So now you're thinking about your view, you're thinking about controls. So what about that? So on BlackBerry 10, on iOS, you have controls like this, right? They look quite nice. The normal iOS user is used to that. So what do we have on BlackBerry 10? So we have basically quite a similar set of controls in many cases. If you go back and look at that again, you can see you've got a date picker and so on. You've got buttons. Our buttons look quite cool. Now, what we want you to do is to create an application that basically feels to the end user like a built-in BlackBerry 10 application. That will enable you to basically have more downloads. That's the bottom line. So we've got a cool set of controls. It's really easy to create them within Cascades. But what about the kind of mapping? So let's go back to my little thing I demoed earlier. So on the left-hand side, you see the iOS version of that sample. On the right-hand side, you see the first cut I had at implementing the application. Now, it looks different to the one I actually demoed to you. That's because, as I said earlier, I went on to actually add in some of the concepts, the user experience concepts that Suavit talked about for BlackBerry 10. But you can see, take for example the toggle bar there on the left-hand side, the one for BlackBerry 10, although it doesn't look exactly the same, it's quite similar, right? Now, I reckon that with your application, where appropriate, you can actually do this mapping and reuse some of your UI design. But what is key, you must remember the UI guidelines and what makes a great BlackBerry 10 application. And that's the kind of rework that you have to do. And as I said earlier, you can, of course, create custom controls if you need to give a particular look and feel. Okay, what about from a kind of class point of view? Well, within BlackBerry 10, as well as being able to drag and drop controls in Momentix, you can also render UI controls dynamically. So this shows you an example of equivalent classes between iOS and BlackBerry 10. You've got, for example, a UI button class, and within Cascades, you've got a button class, and so on. You get it, right? There is, in many cases, a direct mapping between one and another. Now, as Suavit mentioned earlier, there is a porting guide available online, and this gives a direct mapping for all the controls in iOS versus the controls in BlackBerry 10, so it's worth having a look at that. Okay, and one of the cool things, and what makes a great application, I think, within BlackBerry 10, is the list control. Now, you have the equivalent as a table view in iOS. One of the perhaps differences in BlackBerry 10 is the way it maps the UI to data. And it's quite cool. So many of the applications you will have seen, in fact all of them actually, on BlackBerry 10 that use a list, will use the data in this way. So you can map XML data or JSON data, or even you can actually create your own type of data source and map it on to the list. So you can create some quite visually appealing, very nice applications, relatively easy on BlackBerry 10. Obviously it's different to the way you would create an iOS application with a table view, but nonetheless it's actually quite easy to get used to. So do, for example, look at on the left-hand side there, you see a screenshot of the QML cookbook. There's also a C++ version of that, and that is one of the cool samples to go and try out. If you don't know Cascades right now, go download those two samples, the C++ version and the QML one. Go look at either the code for either of those two or both, and you'll see how easy it is to link a list control to some data. It's really very, very easy, and how easy it is, as shown there, to actually make it look pretty. That's the bottom line, which is what you want. Okay. And earlier we talked about Objective-C. Now the fact is, if you've got some code which is written using the kind of message expression syntax in Objective-C style, you're going to have to rewrite that code. That's a fact. But it is true, if you just take this example there, you can see a rectangle, its width being set and its height. Well, that maps on to the equivalent syntax in some code you'd have in BlackBerry 10. So whilst you would have to rewrite it, I would argue that if you wanted to for a particular function, you kind of follow a set of steps to actually do that conversion. So the overall sort of low-level design of your particular bit of code, you could actually remap onto BlackBerry 10. But I'm not going to kid you, it is a rewrite.
In terms of rewriting C and C++ code and Objective-C code, in the porting guide we actually have links. We provide you with links, and there are great articles that actually show you a process, an easier process for doing that, as well as if you have the opportunity to leverage C++, there's also a pointer of how to write something in C++, put it on iOS, and also use it in BlackBerry 10. That's probably the easiest way if you can leverage the same code base. Now let's look at some of the services. What are some of the services that we offer and iOS offers, and how do they map? Well, we'll pick the most common ones that people would use. And in terms of push and push notifications, there's an equivalent mapping, and it's actually, is a little bit of an onboarding process. You have to sign up for the service. On the server side, you have to find out how to post messages to the service, and those services will arrive on your device, and you have to register for the push service. So I'm not going to go into the detail because it's beyond the scope of this presentation, but it's fair to say that there's an equivalent mapping in the push services. It's different the way they're handled in iOS and BlackBerry 10. In iOS, you can have dialog pop-ups, and you can also have these, basically these messages, message board popping from the top. On BlackBerry 10, you could actually push messages to the notifications component in the hub, and from notifications, you can then go access your application, and you can launch your application. You don't have to do it that way. You can post a notification to your application, and you can actually start your application with a push. So right now we don't support background services until the next update, but you could start your application by when you deliver a push, and then your application will be running. And so the question about that comes is, will the application be shut down at some point in time? Yes. Well, if the users launch more than 8 or 12 applications at some point, the application will be shut down at this point in time.
Question.
Yes.
I saw on BlackBerry, is there any equivalent to having a number with a badge?
Well, it's really up to you. So one of the ways, and I haven't seen it done yet because I guess we've just launched in applications. But one of the ways you could do that is the way right now we have the spark symbol on the card. So you can't modify the actual top of the card, but you could modify an active cover. So for example, you could add, you could customize it completely to make it even more appealing to the user, saying if you have workflows, you could say 4 workflows, 1 important, so you could even go beyond that. But that's really your custom code, and it's quite easy to do.
How about on tabs?
Oh.
In my iOS app, I use a tab to show how many items in the shopping cart for one tab.
Mm-hmm.
Any equivalent?
No. So in the hub, you have in the message hub, you have notifications, and it can tell you, how many notifications you've got. And when you go into notifications, you actually have a custom card which you can reprogram. There you can say how many items you've got in the card. And a lot of applications will actually leverage the hub, and so you will go into notifications in the hub, and then from there you can launch. But at some point later on, we're going to open the hub so that you could, put your applications directly in the hub without going through notifications. So, but that's later down the line. Now let's talk about integration and the Invoke framework mainly. Basically, we want to interact with different services. We want to interact with different applications, and that's one of the key messages we've been pushing on BlackBerry 7, and also I think it's worth emphasizing on BlackBerry 10. And on iOS, you can invoke other applications with the UI document interaction controller, and you can basically open a file depending on what the handler is. On BlackBerry 10, we have inbound and outbound invocations. So basically, let's say if in an outbound invocation, meaning is there something registered to open a doc file? If there is if there's a service that's registered to open a doc file, the invocation framework will determine what the service is, and then invoke the necessary application to open a doc file. One of the things that I really want to point out that is a difference between iOS and BlackBerry 10 is the notion of cards. And why that is different is we want to get away from this in and out paradigm, as I was mentioned in the keynote, where you have to launch other applications and you navigate between these applications back and forth. So we've introduced the concept of a card. So what a card is your application or a system application can create a card so that another application can open your application without really launching the full app. What it does, it launches the card in a navigation pane. So how that would be useful. For example, let's say you have a PDF application, and instead of launching the whole PDF viewer application, you can launch a PDF card inside the navigation pane, so it will look like this really came from your application. Now on iOS, you could basically use a viewer, and you could embed that in your application. But that's a different concept, because then you have to manage the viewer itself. With a card, it's very simple, and it's very easy to actually launch and keep the navigation smooth and not worry about managing the memory of a viewer and so. So with cards also, it's worth pointing out that's how we get the peaking, and that's how we get a lot of that functionality. So if you have an application that you think is going to be frequently used by others, I'd recommend you to look at actually providing a card implementation. So let's say if at some point you want to be executed by another application, why not provide a card? Now in terms of social integration, the key pieces here is obviously we want to integrate with social networks, and Facebook. In terms of Facebook, we provide you with certain cards. Twitter, same thing, and then you also have the option to use a web view, and from within the web view you can use OAuth to actually integrate with these other social networks. Now let's contrast, let's say, example of a Facebook integration, because I think iOS is really had many more years on us to really implement the services. So for example, in terms of the mappings here with authentication and let's say showing friends or nearby places or publish an open graph API or actions. In iOS, you can use the native SDK to do those actions. Right now on BlackBerry 10, you would have to use a web view, let's say, to do authentication with OAuth with Facebook. So you have to carry that action through in a web view. Cards will get you to, let's say, publish pictures or publish updates, but it won't get you to do, let's say, to use the graph functionality or other richer features. So I think it's the functionality is there right now, but it's not that easy to use right now on BlackBerry 10. But we're working with Facebook to open those APIs up as well in the near future. Another key piece for integrating with social networks, obviously, is BlackBerry Messenger. And that's really a low-hanging fruit for you as a developer to leverage and make your application more discoverable, more visible, get access to the rich social network. And I think it's something that you should seriously consider for pretty much every application you're writing. And not necessarily every feature, but some of these features to really make your application go viral. Let's look at some of the other considerations, and I'm just going to discuss one point here before I pass it on to Simon. We've discussed how to map from the components and the UI from iOS to BlackBerry 10, but that was a lot in light of the full touch screen devices. Now we have some considerations. We've announced the Q10, and so we have a different screen size, and you have the 720 by 720, 1:1 aspect ratio, and 330 pixels per inch. Now the good news is that if you've developed your application in Cascades, then you get a lot of the scaling, a lot of the asset conversion for free. And so the component scaling will be there for you if you use native Cascades components. If you use custom components, you have to worry about component scaling to some degree. In terms of asset conversion, if you've seen at the keynote, Johan was talking about 9 slicing. So if you actually partition your image so that you actually tell the image how it's going to scale, and then Cascades will scale that image for you. So it's something worth considering. And we have a website on how to actually develop for the Q10 and how to leverage the IDE to put assets in a different directory. And and use best practices there. So it's worth considering that, and don't think of it as an afterthought, because some of the things that will come back later on that may be to your disadvantage is if you actually had used absolute layouts, that would probably be a very bad thing. And there's a tendency, if you don't really know Cascades, there's a tendency to start with absolute layouts, and that's really not a good thing, because then the UI won't scale very well.
Thank you. I'll just add to that as well. When I was first learning Cascades, those layouts actually was kind of one of the hardest areas for me to get used to. So you have a notion of stack layout, dock layout, and absolute layout, where absolute layout you can position precisely where you want something. But the downside is that it won't work so well on the Q device. But once you get used to the concept of dock and stack, how they work, centering, position, and that sort of thing, then basically it's quite easy then, and it does an awful lot of work for you. So, okay, so you've got your iOS app, you've done all the work on the UI, you thought about that, now it's looking quite cool, but of course you've also got other things going on in your application, the kind of business logic, if you like, of that. And so what do you do with maybe your code that uses Foundation or NS classes in iOS? Well, the good news is there actually is a good mapping between those and equivalents on BlackBerry 10. Now, we basically, in BlackBerry 10, we basically have the Qt framework as part of the Qt, or Qt as some people pronounce it. And not only does it do some funky things at high level, it also it has a lot of classes, as you see there, associated with making your job easier. Anything from networking to define a byte array and so on. So again, if you go to our porting guide online, you'll find a good listing of the different classes in NS and the mapping to them in Qt. So it's definitely worth looking at that. Now, of course, the methods within the Qt equivalent classes are going to be different, but there will be a lot of similarity. So in those cases where you do have foundation classes, you'll find that you will be able to probably keep the kind of high-level design, if you like, of that code that's using them, but you're going to have to rewrite it, obviously, for the equivalent Qt classes. But so there will be an element of reuse, but you're still going to have to rewrite some code. One thing I haven't talked about, I will mention that now actually, is that there are an awful lot of libraries that we have ported to BlackBerry 10. And they're all available on GitHub. I think the last time I thought about it, there was something around 50 libraries. And that goes up all the time. And in fact, I think there's a team at RIM, or BlackBerry I should say, who are dedicated to actually porting libraries to BlackBerry 10. So do check us out, because you might find, if quite often is the case, you'll find that a library that you're using on your iOS app is actually already available and ported to BlackBerry 10. So do check out the GitHub repository that we have. The other consideration, of course, is file system and storing data, a key part of your app probably. Now, there are differences between iOS and BlackBerry 10, but there's also a lot of similarities as well. So you can see here's the iOS version structure on the left, roughly, and there it is on the right-hand side in BlackBerry 10. The kind of things, I'm not going to go through this bit by bit, but the kind of things to watch out for are kind of where you're storing your data. There is a particular folder, I forget which folder it is, but you'll find you can store data in this particular folder when you're building your app in debug mode, but suddenly when you build it in release mode, it'll no longer work. You can't write data to this particular folder. So there's differences like that. There's also one cool set of folders to do with sharing data with other applications on the device. And you can do things like say, I want to share this data with other applications, but I don't want those applications to be able to write to it. To that data, I just want them to be able to read that content. So you can do things like that. And as shown in the bottom diagram, both platforms support SQLite, and in fact, that is one of the libraries that we ported to BlackBerry 10. So there's a lot of similarities, but there are some differences. Check out the porting guide again. It does explain it to you. Also, it's very well described on our online documentation. Do check that out.
With SQLite, can all applications access the SQLite, or is it per application? Can other apps read my SQLite data?
Not only if you want it to be accessed. Yeah. Okay. So finally, one other consideration is networking. So the bottom line is there's a very good set of Qt APIs that we've ported to BlackBerry 10 that you can use, like Q network requests, for example. Our platform is pretty strong from a networking point of view. Of course, you're going to have to use a different API to used to, but our platform is pretty strong. And in fact, if I think I'm right in saying in many cases, the APIs are not blocking APIs. So normally, networking APIs will block your thread altogether, but in many cases, they're not. Okay. Oh, and of course, OAuth is supported as well. So we've now come to Q&A session. So does anyone have any questions? Cool. So we'll go for the guy who went first at the back. Oh, there is a mic, I should say, as well.
I have 3 questions. One is, do I have to sign any request done by my push server to authenticate myself on the BlackBerry side, much like Apple requires?
Do you know that?
Sorry, can you...
How do I authenticate the push request for my server?
Well, you basically have to get your own app ID from our push services. So there's a sign-up process. So
Yes.
it's just kind of equivalent, but it's slightly different, but equivalent.
Okay. How do I compensate for the dark theme on the Q10?
What do you mean
Using normal basic controls and Cascades.
why would you compensate if you're using basic controls? Then the graphics should.
Well, my background's white, and I did the lab yesterday.
Yeah.
And then the controls, they invert, but the background image doesn't, so it kind of screws with the design.
Yeah. So one of the recommendations I would make is if you use the assets folder in your IDE. So basically, when you're putting an application for the Q10, you'll put it in the 720 by 720 directory, so you'll have a different background there.
Yeah, okay. I thought, I don't want to have to make every button an image just to have a uniform design, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, understand.
Yeah. But sorry, why would you want, I mean, I guess in a lot of cases, why would you want to do images on like buttons? That's the question.
Because that's a design requirement. My client has designed it a certain way and wants it to look the same on all BlackBerry devices.
Okay.
Okay.
Does the Qt library, which I don't know very well, have any kind of auto-reference counting or smart pointers like iOS seems to do?
Yeah, there is to be honest, I forget the name of it, but there is a particular class that does that, yes.
Yeah, there's a library that you can include for that, C++, but you have to be careful with Qt because in Qt it's actually, there's a good memory management, and so there's an article from our porting guide that we have that points you on how Qt manages memory. So basically, when you have a parent object and all the children objects that are associated with it, if you delete the parent, it will call the distractors on the children. So in some sense, Qt makes it very easy for you to manage memory. So I think it probably is best answered by kind of with another presentation because it's a lengthy subject.
But that approach is what I need.
Yeah. So recommended the link from the porting guide there.
I mean, there is a pointer, I forget the name of it, but if you're writing C++ code, for example, it is a special type of pointer close to what you need. But go look at the online content, it'll explain it to you. Who's next? Doesn't matter, go for one. We'll go for the guy next there, and we'll come to you next. Cool.
I have 2 questions. The first one is, does we have some library like core data on BlackBerry 10?
Yes. Well, yes and no. So we're still working on our data modeling story, and so core data is pretty powerful. So for those of you that don't know, you can actually, it's kind of like almost equivalent to an object relational mapper. You can map your classes to a SQL database, and then you can access those components. If you look at Qt, There's a, I forget what it's called. I think it's called, I was actually anticipating this question, so I have it. It's called QSQL Query Model APIs. So you can get extract the data and you can query SQL in the same fashion, and then you can put it in a class and you can have you can access that like a map in a mapping table. It's not as clean yet as the iOS core data model is, but it gets you there to properly modeling your data in an object relational-like fashion. The only piece that it's missing is actually connecting that data to an actual component, to a visual component right away, which is what iOS provides you with. But you can do that fairly easily. So you can really model your data using that QSQL table query model component in Qt. So basically check out Google for Qt data model, and then you can do that. But since Qt actually has Qt components, in Qt you can actually use Qt data query model directly in your UI, but in Cascades you cannot, because the Cascades components don't support. So you have to write an extra layer. But there is a way which you can actually use.
Second question is, on iOS, I can schedule a push notification from Apple server, but I can also schedule a local push notification for my app. Can I schedule local push notification on BlackBerry 10?
So no, for local schedule you can't. We're looking at, I mean, this is a common request, feature request that we're getting. It's kind of like a timer. You know, can you have a timer which wakes you up at a certain point in time in some way? And we're looking at bringing that that in the next release.
Okay, thank you.
So for the guy over here, the bobble hat.
Yeah, in iOS, I'm able to subclass the core services like, I don't know, UI, table view, or navigation view. So I input, I override with my own design. Am I able to do that? Like give the navigation bar something like my design?
So we went away from subclassing in Cascades, and we favor composition. Okay. So rather than subclassing, you would create a component and you would add, let's say, your table view to it, or a component that table view is built on, or not table view, but a list view is built on, or list item component. You'd create a custom list item component using composition. Mm-hmm. So we went in favor of composition because it favors performance, so that our renderer can faster the UI at a faster pace, rather than using inheritance. Like we had inheritance in Java that potentially leads to blocking UI. So in Cascades, it's really hard to block the UI. So that's the approach we take.
Okay, well, I think we have time for probably 1 to 2 questions more. So we'll go for this guy here, and then we'll go for you at the back, and that's it.
Hi, from the MVC pattern point of view, so is there any counterpart class that's similar to the UI view controller does? Or what's the common practice if you want, say, control view screens or panes separately in different class?
The control is really built into the MVC pattern is really built into the list view itself. So when you look at the description of the list view itself, you have your model, you have your view, and you have your controller. In terms of actually providing a custom one, you can use you can have your own data model, overwrite that as well. So you certainly have that capability. It just, I guess in iOS, the way it happens, it's just explicitly given to you. So it's kind of visible as like you're building it based on MVC, and it's a little bit more implicit and the way it's structured on BlackBerry 10, but it's there.
Okay, and the gentleman at the back, and that's the last question, I'm afraid.
I just want to make the point that porting an application, particularly business logic, is much de-risked by using a unit test framework. I don't know if either of you have come across anything that could be used for BB10 or is anything in the pipeline?
What was the name of that framework?
A unit test framework.
Oh, a unit test framework.
Yeah.
The question comes up a lot, and there are unit test frameworks for Qt as well as C++, but we're still investigating, the best choice for that, and we realize that, we need to make some kind of documentation, create documentation around that. So I think it's something we need to update still.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think we actually do have time for one very, very quick question if somebody wants to put one in, or we'll call it a day. Okay?
All right, one question here.
One question that we do.
Regarding the last question, if you don't have a unit testing there, how do you do regression tests for the browser or for the other components now?
We're not saying we don't have unit testing. I mean, C++ and Qt have unit testing frameworks themselves. It's just that right now we haven't really documented the best practices for unit testing. The internal teams have their unit testing frameworks all set up. It's just in terms of like reaching out to developers, providing it and documenting it to developers as a best practice. We haven't done that yet because we're still investigating the best way of doing that.
Okay, thank you.
That's a good question. Okay, well, thank you ever so much for coming today. I hope you enjoyed the session. Thank you very much.